Hi, it's Kirsten again. Welcome back. I apologize for it taking so long for me to get this video up. I had kind of a rough week last week. Just got really sick and wasn't doing well. So I just took the week for myself. Any of you were like overly excited about chapter 4 like I was. Maybe I let myself down more than anybody, but I was really excited about getting chapter 4 up and then I got sick. So better now. So here we are with chapter 4. I'm going to go ahead and get started pretty quick here. Just a recap of what's coming up. We get to know Leonard a little better. We get to see him and Larissa react together again, and he finally meets Vesta. So this should be an interesting one. It's one of my favorites, just like I said. It's where the book really picks up and takes on a new momentum, so to speak. It just gets more and more exciting from here. So yeah, let's get started. Oh, I lost my paperback book, the one that I was reading. I cleaned my room and yeah, it disappeared. I'm not sure where it is, so I'm using an old hardback cover. I should read this time. So here we go. Chapter 4, Leonard Mason. Leonard made his way across the school, heading to his next class, drama. He had originally had wood shop, but he changed his schedule the previous Friday. It was the only class he didn't have any of his annoying friends in, which was why he switched his classes. He needed a break from them. Yes, he found them annoying. They were lemmings, followers, and he had no respect for people who couldn't think for themselves, which, considering certain things about his life, was pretty ironic. He didn't hate them. He just didn't care about them one way or the other. Leonard was never into the whole big man on campus thing. He never felt like he needed a bunch of flunkies following him around doing his bidding, but a certain member of his family did. To be more specific, his grandfather, who had been raising him since he was 7, felt that way very much. Leonard would have been content to just be normal. He didn't need the prestige of being the most popular and powerful boy in school. But because of his family position in the town, it just kind of happened. He just went along with it and didn't fight it. He knew that if he were to step outside of the mold that he had been put in by his grandfather, that it would make him very upset. And that's the last thing he wanted to do, was to upset his grandfather. So he went along with it to keep things content. Status quo. Safe. When he was 7 years old, his parents were planning a week-long ski trip. The whole family was going to go, his mother, his father, his older brother Frederick, and him. A week before the trip, he got an invitation to a birthday party of a friend from school. He was very excited about getting the invitation, and he didn't really want to miss it. His parents knew how much the birthday party meant to him, and they left the decision up to him. They knew full well that this wasn't the first family ski trip, and it certainly wasn't going to be the last. So if he wasn't at this one, the next one would come along in a year's time. Leonard thought about it, as long and as hard as his 7-year-old mind could think, and in the end he decided to stay, and his parents were fine with that decision. That one decision, though, would change his life forever. Leonard lost his parents and Frederick in a car crash on that very ski trip to Mount Hood. Their car skidded on some ice and went off the road over an embankment, killing them all instantly. Frederick had been the promise of the Mason family since he was born. His grandfather had started grooming him to take over the family business, and Frederick gladly accepted the role. He was 13 years old on that tragic day, and ever since that day, Leonard's grandfather didn't let him forget that he now had to take over his brother's place. His life had been fairly normal till then, but now it was constantly being scrutinized by his grandfather, who always had to know where he was going, who he was with, and how he was doing in his classes at school. It had become a nightly dinner-time activity. Grandfather sat at the dinner table with a schedule book and asked him the same questions he did every other night, occasionally stopping him so that he could write something down. No small talk, no friendly banter, just business. Business, business, business. Even with the constant attention and interference from his grandfather, he always felt so alone, and somehow had the feeling that that fact would never change. He didn't like feeling this way, but he'd accepted it, and just went along for the ride. His grandfather believed wholeheartedly in the old cliché, spare the rod and spoil the child, and Leonard quickly adapted to living within his grandfather's rules, if only to keep from having regular beatings from the man. At first it was difficult. He was young, and he didn't know that certain things were not to be discussed or certain people were not to be associated with, let alone understanding all the pressure that was on his shoulders now that Frederick was gone. After the first few years and the first few beatings, he learned quickly to fall in line. He had to. for his own sanity. He let his mind go numb on the way to the auditorium. It had been a long day, and he was glad to have such an easy class at the end of the day. He walked across the commons to the auditorium door and pulled it, only to find it locked. He paused outside the door, assuming that he must be the first one there. But as he turned around, he saw three people he didn't know walk through a door beside the auditorium, and he walked over to the door and looked into the window. Behind the door was a hallway that ran alongside the auditorium, and he saw the three people who'd entered the hall walk into a side entrance of the auditorium, so he decided to follow them. He opened the door and headed into the drama hall, his mind not particularly thinking about anything, and entered the auditorium and took a seat in the third row back around the middle. He did feel a little out of his element, since he didn't know anyone in this class. But he didn't want anyone else to see he felt uneasy, so he kicked his feet up on the chair in front of him and made himself comfortable. He tried to clear his mind as he closed his eyes and took a few tired breaths, ignoring the people filing into the room. Then he heard her. He recognized that voice. He snapped his eyes open, and there she was, walking into the auditorium, talking to a tall red-haired girl he hadn't seen before. "I think you'll like the drama teacher," she said to the red-haired girl, who watched her with a smile. "Mrs. Greenway is great." "I'm glad I know someone in this class, Larissa," the red-haired girl said. "It makes things easier." Leonard watched the two girls walk and take a seat in the second row, and found himself feeling irritated that she didn't notice him there. Surely she would have reacted the same way she always did, which he loved to watch. He knew she pretended to ignore him, but also that she was very aware of his presence. He had seen it many times, watched her whole body become rigid and her eyes almost darken as the hate that she felt towards him seethed behind her chocolate brown eyes. It wasn't a reaction that he really wanted from her, but it was a reaction nonetheless, and at least he knew she was aware of him. He'd take it. He watched the two girls converse, starting to get somewhat annoyed that she still hadn't noticed he was there. Usually he was the first person she saw. "I guess she didn't see me," he said to himself. "I'll give her a few more minutes." He waited. He sat and watched her talking to the red-haired girl with her back to him. He noticed the softness of her hair when she shook her head, and it brushed along her shoulders. He saw her long graceful fingers as she tucked her hair behind her ear, and he could see the blush on her cheek and wondered if it was as soft as it looked. He waited, but she still didn't notice. Mrs. Greenway came in and slammed the auditorium door, calling attention to herself. "Welcome to theater class today, students," she announced with a clearly melodramatic tone. "I hope you were able to read over the syllabus I handed out last week. I require your signed copy in my hand today." She paused to see if anyone squirmed at the mention of the minimal homework. She seemed to enjoy watching her class become uncomfortable when she mentioned things like this. "Very good. Let's get started. This week, as stated in the syllabus, we will begin to explore the basics of what it's like to become a member of the theater. What it means to be a thespian," she said with a flip of her hand to add dramatic effect. "We will learn about stage blocking and different types of acting styles." She paused and scanned the room to make sure everyone was still attentive before continuing. "Now I know some of you are very much looking forward to doing scenes, but be patient, my little thespians. One must learn to walk before they can run. That is why we learn the basics first. Once I am sure you understand the basics, we will begin to pair up with partners to perform scenes. As I mentioned last week, I will be choosing who you partner with, and it will be different people each time. To answer a question posed to me last Friday by a very inquisitive student, she let her eyes pause on a girl a few rows in front of Leonard to his left, and smiled at her for a moment before finishing. I want you all to learn to work with different acting styles, and to become accustomed to change," she said, pausing to listen for groans that a few of the less eager students let slip. Now, class, you all knew this would be a part of it. Might as well save your grumbles." As Leonard heard Miss Greenway talk about the scene partners, his eyes and thoughts wandered over to Larissa, who continued to be oblivious to his presence. What would she say if she were paired with me for a scene? He wondered to himself. His pulse raced at the thought. "We have a couple of new students in our class today, so I'd like to do an acting exercise that will not just be good practice in interaction, but will also get some introductions out of the way. Would you all kindly stand in a straight line on the stage, facing downstage, if you please?" Miss Greenway asked, and watched as the 20 or so students reluctantly left their seats and went up onto the stage. Leonard walked behind Larissa and the red-headed girl. He stared at the back of her head, wondering what her reaction would be when she finally noticed him there. He could smell her scent as it drifted behind her as she walked, and he unconsciously took a deep breath to absorb it. They stopped on stage, the redhead girl standing between Larissa and him, the talking of the other students buzzing around them. "Let's quiet down now," Miss Greenway said loudly from the front row. "Now, I will give you a number." Miss Greenway proceeded to count off. 1, 2, 1, 2, and she pointed to a different student with each number. She pointed to Larissa and said 2. Then she pointed to the redhead girl and said 1. Then finally Leonard and said 2, and numbered a few other students who had lined up behind Leonard. "I'd like all the ones to turn to the twos, face them, and introduce yourself. I don't care if you already know them, as most of you I'm sure do. It's an acting exercise. I want you to introduce yourself like this is your first time meeting," she explained. "State your name to them, and one interesting fact about yourself. Then the twos introduce yourself to the ones." Everyone stood like they were waiting for more instructions. Then Miss Greenway said with an impatient tone, "Begin! What are you waiting for?" Leonard turned and saw the redhead girl staring right at him, with an odd smile on her face. She was pretty, but there was something that was unsettling about the way she looked at him. She was slightly shorter than him, maybe a couple of inches, but that wasn't what it was that bothered him. It was her gaze, the way she looked at him, like she was dissecting him with her eyes. She held her hand out to him and said, without a hint of nervousness, "I'm Vesta, and I love to swim." Leonard looked at her hand, hovering in the space between them, and took it slowly and shook it. Still looking at her hand, he said, "I'm Leonard, and I... He stopped and thought. He couldn't think of what to say. He didn't know if it was the way Vesta looked at him, or if he really just wasn't that interesting. But he couldn't think of anything to say at all. "Yes," she said after a long pause, waiting wide-eyed for him to tell her something. "I don't know," he said, a little ashamed. "You don't know what's interesting about yourself?" she asked. "Not really," he replied, still looking at her hand. "Well," she said, "I don't know what to say to that. Can I call you Lenny?" "Not if you want me to answer," he replied, sounding a little harsh. That did it, the harsh tone in his voice. Larissa turned and peeked around Vesta to gape right at Leonard, who stood there still holding on to Vesta's hand. He was surprised it had taken that long, but there she was, looking at him from behind Vesta, her brown eyes burning holes into him as she stared at him as hard as she could. She had a cute little wrinkle in the middle of her eyebrow that she got when she was angry, and the cleft in her chin got deeper when she scowled at him. He stood looking at her for a moment, taking in her face, as he felt himself flush at the sight of her. "Wow," Vesta said matter-of-factly, "your hand's starting to sweat." He ripped his hand out of Vesta's grip so fast that she was pulled forward and almost bumped into him. "What are you doing here?" Larissa said to him as she fumed. "You know him, Larissa?" Vesta asked. "Oh yeah," Leonard jibed. "We're old friends, aren't we, Nightmare?" "Didn't she tell you we were old friends?" he repeated, looking at Vesta. "Oh, cool," Vesta said excitedly. "This class should be fun, then." "I wouldn't bet on it, Vesta," Larissa said to her under her breath, but Leonard clearly heard, and it made his heart ache a little. "Oh, come on, Nightmare," he said in retaliation. "Admit it. It will be fun. At least for me," he said, as he flashed Larissa the nastiest smile he could muster. Larissa fumed at him and turned to walk off the stage with Vesta following right behind her. "I'm not going anywhere, Nightmare," he sarcastically sang at her as she walked past him, and his heart beat a little faster as he watched her walk away from him angrily. Larissa sat as far as she could from Leonard the rest of the period, keeping half an eye on him so she wasn't surprised by anything he did. Vesta seemed oblivious to the tension between them. Of course she wouldn't know, though. How could she? She was new to the school, after all. "He seemed nice," Vesta said with a smile. "I hate him," Larissa replied, trying not to show too much emotion. Vesta just looked at her with a confused look on her face. Should she tell her how mean he is? Or would Vesta think it was petty of her? Was it fair for her to not give Vesta the chance to get to know Leonard so she could form her own opinion? Not really. It wasn't her place to tell people what to think or how to feel, so she decided not to elaborate. She began to pack up her bag after a few moments of silence between them before Vesta finally spoke up. "Well, he must really like you," Vesta said. "What?" Larissa spat as she stood up and faced Vesta to make sure she wasn't joking. "What are you talking about? Leonard Mason definitely does not like me, that's for sure." Larissa watched Vesta staring over her shoulder in the direction of Leonard. Then Vesta said something that hit Larissa like a ton of bricks. Well, if he doesn't, he certainly is paying a lot of attention to you for no reason, and she motioned by a nod of her chin for Larissa to look in Leonard's direction. Larissa turned to see Leonard staring at her with an almost longing look on his face. As she turned, their eyes met, and his ice blue eyes burned with intensity. For a moment he didn't look himself. He looked hopeful, like he was anticipating something, waiting for something good to happen. She wasn't sure what to think of the look on his face, but it made her hair stand excitedly on end. Then, as she stood looking at his eyes and tingling all over, his face changed into the expression she was used to, smug, superior, and he turned away from her. She looked away and continued to pack her backpack, pretending that nothing had just happened. Vesta watched Larissa as they left the auditorium and didn't say anything. She just walked along, feeling Larissa's struggle with the hate that she had held on to help her survive, and a new curiosity she couldn't help but feel. She'd planted the seed, and hopefully, like grass that breaks through concrete, it will break through the wall that Larissa lived behind. So there we go. That was chapter 4. You get a little bit into Leonard's head in that chapter, which is, I don't know, I always thought it was kind of exciting. Chapter 5 coming up is a little bit more about Leonard. You get to know him a little bit more, and he and Vesta become better friends. So that's a little bit exciting. Yeah, the book's just picking up from here, so stay tuned. And don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to like my video. Comment if you have any questions or comments that you'd like to share with the class. Yeah, I'm going to put a link to the video I did with my daughter Nikki. We did a Mother's Day mom tag video, which was kind of fun. So I'm going to put a link to it so you guys can watch it. I'll try to get chapter 5 up soon. So thanks for joining me. See you next time. Bye.